The uranium mirage. Why the Iran deal exposes a collapsing strategic order. Let us begin with something the headlines will not tell you. The spectacle unfolding between Washington and Tehran right now is not primarily a negotiation about nuclear enrichment. It is a stress test of American strategic coherence, and the results, examined soberly, are not flattering to the side that believes it holds all the leverage. The framing matters enormously here because what is being presented to Western audiences as a diplomatic triumph in progress is, upon closer inspection, an illustration of how thoroughly the architecture of post-Cold War American hegemony has degraded. When you hear that Iran is handing over uranium, pause. Understand what that phrase conceals. No final document exists. No verified concession on enrichment infrastructure has been made. The enriched stockpile Iran has accumulated, the centrifuges, the technical knowledge embedded in thousands of trained engineers and physicists, none of that evaporates because a memorandum of understanding is floated in Omani back channels. What is actually on the table, if we strip away the optimistic framing, is an agreement about agreeing, a framework for future talks. In diplomatic terminology, that is roughly equivalent to two parties agreeing to meet again to discuss whether they want to negotiate. The distance between that and Iran hands over uranium is not a matter of nuance. It is a matter of strategic reality versus strategic theater. The situation inside the Iranian decision-making structure deserves far more analytical attention than it is receiving. What we are observing is not simply the eccentricity of a paranoid supreme leader retreating into bunkers. What we are observing is the operational fragmentation of a state under sustained multi-domain pressure, financial, kinetic, psychological, infrastructural, that has produced something genuinely unprecedented in the history of modern statecraft. The Iranian leadership cannot speak with a unified voice, not because its members are incompetent, but because the pressure applied against the system has fractured its internal communication architecture to the point where no single actor can commit the whole. The Revolutionary Guards do not recognize the foreign ministry as their superior. The foreign ministry cannot bind the supreme leader. The supreme leader, physically isolated and operating through a chain of couriers that introduces days of latency into every exchange, cannot effectively coordinate with any of them in real time. This is what systemic collapse looks like from the inside before it becomes visible from the outside. Not a dramatic implosion, not a sudden surrender, a gradual inability to translate political will into coherent operational decisions. When an American proposal crosses the table and three different Iranian factions issue three mutually contradictory responses within 48 hours, that is not a negotiating tactic. That is institutional incoherence. And institutional incoherence at the moment of maximum external pressure is one of the most dangerous conditions a nuclear-adjacent state can be in. Not because it makes that state more aggressive, but because it makes it unpredictable in ways that even its own leadership cannot forecast. Now, the Trump administration's approach to this situation has been described in both supportive and hostile media as unconventional. That description is accurate, but insufficient. What distinguishes this negotiating posture from the Obama-era JCPOA process is not merely stylistic. It is structural. The JCPOA was negotiated under conditions of American military restraint, where the implicit message to Tehran was that the military option was real but distant, and where the economic relief offered was substantial and front-loaded. The Iranians, quite rationally from their perspective, accepted financial oxygen in exchange for temporary constraints they calculated they could eventually reverse. And they were correct. They did reverse them. The JCPOA did not eliminate Iran's nuclear program. It deferred it, generously funded the deferral, and handed Iran a decade of relative economic stabilization, during which the regime consolidated domestic control and expanded regional influence. The current situation is categorically different. Negotiations are proceeding under active naval blockade. American carrier groups are positioned, not rhetorically, but physically, within operational range. Iranian infrastructure has already absorbed kinetic strikes. The Strait of Hormuz, which for decades served as Tehran's most powerful strategic card, the implicit threat that kept Gulf monarchies deferential and global energy markets nervous, has been materially degraded as a leverage instrument. The Emirati bypass pipeline through Fujairah represents years of strategic preparation by Abu Dhabi to sever the link between Iranian goodwill and regional energy security. The Saudis have accelerated their own export infrastructure diversification. Shipping companies have rerouted, reinsured, and restructured their Gulf operations. The card Iran believed it held permanently is expiring in real time, and that expiration is largely irreversible, regardless of how the current negotiations conclude. This is the context in which one must evaluate Israel's anxiety about the emerging framework. Israeli strategic thinking on this question is not irrational, and dismissing it as mere hawkishness misses the operational logic entirely. The Israeli concern is specific and technically grounded. An agreement that addresses the Strait of Hormuz, provides economic relief to Tehran, and extends a formal ceasefire, while leaving Iran's enriched uranium stockpile in place, its centrifuge infrastructure intact, and its ballistic missile inventory untouched, does not reduce the nuclear threat. It funds it. It stabilizes the regime that sustains it. It buys time for an opponent that has demonstrated, repeatedly and without ambiguity, that it uses diplomatic pauses to reconsolidate rather than to genuinely transform. The phrase used in Israeli strategic circles is important. Not freeze, not postpone, but remove. The distinction is not semantic. A frozen program can be thawed. A postponed program can be reactivated. A removed program, enrichment facilities dismantled, stockpile exported, centrifuge chains broken and verified, cannot be reconstituted in months. It requires years of industrial reconstruction that would be visible to intelligence collection. The Israeli demand for removal rather than suspension reflects an understanding that in the Middle East, a paused nuclear program under a regime with demonstrated deceptive capacity is not a security achievement. It is a delayed detonation. What makes this moment genuinely complex, and what most Western commentary obscures, is the layered nature of the Iranian threat architecture. The nuclear dimension receives the most coverage because it carries the most existential weight symbolically. But the operational threat to regional stability runs through a separate channel entirely. The proxy network that extends from the Houthi positions in Yemen through Iraqi militia infrastructure into Syrian supply corridors and ultimately into southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah maintains the most sophisticated non-state military capability in history. This is not hyperbole. Hezbollah's arsenal, its tunnel engineering, its anti-tank guided missile inventory, its precision rocket stockpile, and its drone warfare development represent a military force that would have been the envy of many formal state militaries 2 decades ago. The tunnel destroyed in the recent IDF operation in southern Lebanon is not an isolated infrastructure element. It represents the physical expression of decades of Iranian strategic investment in deniable, distributed, persistent military presence on Israel's northern border. The ceasefire in Lebanon, which is currently being violated with sufficient regularity that IDF soldiers are dying from fiber optic guided FPV drones despite the cessation of formal hostilities, illustrates a fundamental problem with the diplomatic framework being constructed in Oman and Muscat. An agreement that addresses Iran at the top of the command structure while leaving Hezbollah's operational capability intact along Israel's northern border does not represent strategic resolution. It represents Iranian deterrence preserved at one level while Iranian aggression continues at another. Tehran's representatives can sincerely negotiate in good faith at the diplomatic table, while the Revolutionary Guard's External Operations Directorate continues to supply, equip, and direct Hezbollah with equal sincerity. These are not contradictory activities from Tehran's strategic perspective. They are complementary ones. The death of a 19-year-old combat engineer from Eilat in southern Lebanon, killed by a drone guided through fiber optics, specifically because fiber optic control defeats electronic jamming systems, tells you something important about the technological adaptation cycle of the forces Israel is contending with.
Fiber optic guided munitions are not a novelty in military development. They have existed in various forms for decades. But their integration into cheap, mass-producible, first-person view drone platforms represents a qualitative shift in the accessible lethality available to sub-state actors operating under Iranian patronage. Electronic warfare systems, which represent an enormous investment in Israeli and American defense budgets, are partially neutered by the simple expedient of removing the radio frequency link. The drone becomes, in effect, a wire-guided anti-armor weapon delivered by air at dramatically lower cost than the systems designed to intercept it. This is what industrial warfare adaptation looks like when one side has the luxury of time, external supply, and a strategic patron willing to fund iterative weapons development. Iran has invested in Hezbollah not as a terrorist organization in the Western definitional sense, a group primarily oriented towards spectacular violence against civilian targets, but as a forward-deployed combined arms force capable of contesting Israeli military operations along a well-defined terrain corridor. The distinction matters enormously for understanding why the IDF's presence in southern Lebanon, however politically uncomfortable and diplomatically inconvenient, represents genuine operational necessity rather than territorial ambition. Remove the IDF from southern Lebanon and you do not create a buffer. You create a firing position. The espionage dimension of this conflict, the Iranian cyber operation designated by Western intelligence as Smoke Sandstorm or Screaming Serpents, deserves more than a footnote in this analysis. The technical method exposed. Application domain manager hijacking, exploiting the initialization phase of .NET runtime environments to bypass endpoint detection, represents a level of operational sophistication that is not produced by improvised hacker cells. This is the product of systematic state investment in offensive cyber capability, developed over years, deployed precisely when kinetic operations are under negotiation pressure, and targeted at the intelligence infrastructure of Iran's principal adversaries. The timing is not coincidental. When your missiles are grounded by ceasefire conditions and your naval presence in contested waters is under blockade, cyber operations become your primary tool for intelligence collection and infrastructure penetration. Tehran is operating simultaneously in kinetic, diplomatic, proxy, and cyber domains. The Western analytical tendency to evaluate each domain in isolation systematically understates the integrated nature of the Iranian strategic approach, which returns us to the question of what the Trump administration actually achieves if it concludes something presentable before the end of the year. The answer depends entirely on what something presentable means in practice. And here, the interests of Washington and Jerusalem diverge in ways that both governments are working hard to obscure publicly. Washington wants reduced energy price pressure, an open Strait of Hormuz, a foreign policy headline, and a demonstration that economic and military pressure produces diplomatic results, all of which are legitimate policy goals. Jerusalem wants the permanent removal of the nuclear program, the disarmament of Hezbollah, and enforceable verification mechanisms with defined consequences for Iranian violation, all of which are also legitimate but substantially more demanding. The gap between those two sets of requirements is not bridgeable by clever diplomatic language. It is structural. And the history of Iranian negotiating behavior, not as a matter of moral judgment, but as an empirical record of how Tehran has operated across multiple administrations, multiple frameworks, and multiple inspections regimes, suggests that any agreement which leaves ambiguity in those three areas will, over time, resolve that ambiguity in Tehran's favor. This is not because Iranian diplomats are uniquely dishonest. It is because they are operating with a coherent, long-term strategic objective:
preservation of the regime and development of strategic deterrence, against which each individual negotiating concession is evaluated instrumentally. They yield what they must yield in the moment to relieve maximum pressure, and they reconstitute what they can reconstitute when that pressure eases.
The question that ought to be generating far more serious analysis in Western strategic circles is this: what is the enforcement mechanism? When Iran's enrichment activity resumes, as it has resumed after every previous agreement, what does the response look like? Reimposition of sanctions requires multilateral consensus that tends to erode precisely because the economic interests of European and Asian trading partners are well served by normal commercial relations with Iran. Military options against the state that has now demonstrated it can survive significant strikes, that has distributed its nuclear infrastructure across hardened underground facilities, and that retains the capacity for asymmetric retaliation through proxy forces across multiple theaters simultaneously, those options carry costs that American domestic politics may not be prepared to absorb in a second round. The Abraham Accords expansion dimension of Trump's regional vision is interesting strategically, but faces genuine structural obstacles that optimistic framing tends to minimize. Saudi Arabia has conditioned normalization with Israel on a defined pathway to Palestinian statehood. That condition is not merely rhetorical. It reflects domestic political constraints within the kingdom that even Mohammed bin Salman cannot simply override without cost. Qatar, which funds Hamas's political bureau and serves as a critical interlocutor for any Gaza reconstruction scenario, has its own complicated calculus regarding normalization. Turkey, whose NATO membership continues to complicate Western strategic coherence, is operating under Erdogan's Islamic solidarism framework that makes formal alignment with Israel politically untenable, regardless of the economic logic. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, a domestic Islamist constituency, and a civil-military relationship that has historically constrained foreign policy flexibility on precisely these questions. This does not mean the regional architecture is static. The UAE's public acknowledgement of direct military action against Iranian targets, Saudi Arabia's deployment of air defense imagery alongside footage of the Hajj gathering, these are not accidental communications. They represent a deliberate recalibration of Gulf states' strategic positioning toward explicit alignment against Iranian regional hegemony. That recalibration has been accelerating for years, driven by the Houthi threat to Saudi infrastructure, by Iranian proxy attacks on Abu Dhabi, and by the fundamental incompatibility between Gulf monarchical stability and Iranian revolutionary ideology. The question is not whether the Gulf states are moving toward de facto alignment with Israeli security interests. They manifestly are. The question is whether that alignment can be formalized before the next cycle of conflict resets the political conditions. What remains under-examined in virtually all Western coverage of this situation is the domestic Iranian dimension. The Revolutionary Guards are not simply a military force. They are the largest single economic actor in Iran, controlling an estimated 30 to 40% of the formal economy and substantially more through informal networks. Any agreement that includes serious sanctions relief represents a financial recapitalization of an organization that has spent the last several years watching its economic empire erode under combined pressure. The Guards understand this. The reformist elements of the Iranian government understand it differently. They see sanctions relief as an opportunity to strengthen the civilian economy and potentially build a constituency for regime evolution. Those are not compatible visions. And the negotiations in Oman are, among other things, a proxy battleground between those two factions for control of Iran's post-war economic trajectory. The people of Iran, the citizens of Tehran and Isfahan and Mashhad, who have watched their currency collapse, their water infrastructure deteriorate, their educated class emigrate, and their political dissidents executed for the crime of visibility, they are the silent variable in every strategic calculation that treats the Islamic Republic
as a monolithic actor. The regime's legitimacy deficit is structural and worsening. The Revolutionary Guard's response to that legitimacy deficit has been intensified repression, which generates further alienation, which requires further repression. That cycle does not sustain itself indefinitely. Whether it breaks through external pressure, internal fracture, or some combination that no analyst can precisely forecast, is the genuinely open question at the center of Iranian strategic futures. What history suggests, drawn from the comparative cases of states under sustained systemic pressure, from the Soviet Union's terminal phase to the Ceausescu regime's final months to the collapse of the Shah's government in 1979 itself, is that the most dangerous period is not the period of maximum pressure. It is the period immediately after an agreement provides temporary relief. Because relief does not resolve the underlying legitimacy crisis. It postpones it. And a regime that has survived through repression, that has built its institutional identity around revolutionary resistance to external pressure, does not know how to govern through normalcy. Normalcy is existentially threatening to the ideological infrastructure that justifies its monopoly on violence. That is the deepest strategic irony of the current moment. An agreement that gives Iran's regime enough relief to stabilize may paradoxically accelerate the internal contradictions that are already tearing at its foundations. A regime that survives through crisis cannot easily survive through commerce. The Revolutionary Guards, who have profited from sanctions-era black market networks, face a legitimacy challenge from economic normalization that is as threatening to their institutional interests as any military strike. These are not abstractions. They are the structural dynamics that will determine whether the agreement currently being constructed in Muscat represents the beginning of a genuine regional transformation or simply the next iteration of a cycle that has been repeating with increasing destructive potential for the last 4 decades. The American Navy remains in position. The Israeli Air Force maintains its freedom of action and has publicly refused to accept diplomatic constraints on its operational planning. The Hezbollah frontier continues to generate casualties despite the ceasefire framework. The Iranian supreme leader continues to govern through couriers in an undisclosed bunker, which is not a detail about one man's psychological state, but a metric of systemic dysfunction in the state he nominally controls. Oil markets are pricing in optimism that the physical reality of the Strait of Hormuz does not yet justify. And somewhere in the distance, a 19-year-old soldier from Eilat, who will not return home, suggests that whatever agreements are being discussed in hotel conference rooms in Oman, the war itself continues to make its own calculations. The situation is more complex, more dangerous, and more consequential than the public framing allows. That is almost always true in the Middle East. What makes this moment different is the convergence of multiple simultaneous instabilities. Iranian internal fragmentation, Israeli operational urgency, American domestic political pressure for a visible foreign policy achievement, Gulf state strategic realignment, and the looming question of what Hezbollah does the moment it calculates the IDF will withdraw, into a window where miscalculation carries costs that would not be containable within the region. That is the reality underneath the headlines, and it deserves to be understood with the seriousness it demands.